My name is Stephen Williamson. I am from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I'm director of the foundation at Southeast Technical College and chair-elect of the South Dakota Humanities Council. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Humanities Council, which produces the annual Festival of Books. We hope you'll enjoy the festival and you'll provide some feedback for this event. The link is on the online on your online survey. It's available at southsdbooksfestival.com. There's a QR code. It can be found on our information tables. You can help us keep the festival free by making a donation. I'm not going to go into that, but for the price of what you paid today for your latte or maybe something you had last night on on a monthly basis, you could just give up a latte and maybe you could help us out at the South Dakota Humanities Council because it goes to a good cause, as you can see. Um, we are also very appreciative of the supporters and the sponsors of this event. And you can find those on the back of your festival guide. Again, none of this would be possible without the wonderful supporters that we have of the South Dakota Humanities Council. Today's program is called The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, the Women Who Created a President. And maybe like you, I thought I had closed the book on TR after reading Edmund Morris's book, the three-part exceptional uh, uh, history on Teddy Roosevelt. And then when I saw this, I go, well, what's this all about? Because I thought I knew everything about TR. And having just bought the book yesterday and just reading the preface, I'm very excited to jump back in with TR and one of the great American presidents, but also at this, also one that neither political party wants to claim. So that's kind of nice. So let me go ahead and introduce our speaker today and author. Edward O'Keefe is CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library Foundation and author of The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. He spent 2 decades in broadcast and digital media at ABC News, CNN, Now This, receiving Primetime Emmy Award, 2 Webby Awards, the Edward R. Murrow Award, and a George Foster Peabody Award for ABC's coverage of 9/11. He is a former fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. O'Keefe was born in North Dakota and now lives in New York with his family. So everybody give a nice warm South Dakota welcome to Edward O'Keefe. You bet, right? You bet.
Thank you. Well, hello, everyone, and good morning. I am so excited to be with you in the other Dakota today. As Steve mentioned, I am a native of North Dakota, but I've made the trip on I-29 today to be with you, despite now living in New York City. So, The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt argues that the most masculine president in the American memory is actually the product of extraordinary and unsung women. It all begins, of course, with Theodore Roosevelt's remarkable family, and you see them on the screen up in front of you. Martha Bullock Roosevelt, his mother, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., known as Thee, whom we'll talk about more in a moment, his father. Mittie and Thee had 4 children. Anna Roosevelt Cowles, known as Bammy, Theodore Roosevelt, who is, of course, the most famous of their children, Elliott Roosevelt, who is the father of Eleanor Roosevelt, and Corrine Roosevelt Robinson. 2 girls, 2 boys in this remarkable American family. I'm going to go ahead and scroll here for you. So let's start where it all begins with Mom. So Theodore Roosevelt's mother, Mittie, who was, of course, also Eleanor Roosevelt's grandmother, she was the inspiration for Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. if that gives you some sense of her personality. She was born in Connecticut, but actually raised and lived most of her life in Georgia. And she was a Southern belle. She met and married a Northerner, a New Yorker, which you'll hear more about in further in the talk. And then, of course, lived with the Roosevelt family in New York. But she never lost those dedicated Southern roots. She was a ardent Confederalist. She supported the Confederacy during the Civil War, and she was witty, sharp tongued. She had these incredibly coy turns of phrase. It was actually Mitty who introduced her children to these extraordinary books, the McGuffey Readers. And they had all these different phrases in them, including the African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. So it was Mitty who had this vivacious and lively personality that she infected her children with empathy. She actually lost contact with two of her stepbrothers during the Civil War, and her mother and sister both came from Georgia and moved in with the Roosevelt family. So Thee, whom we'll talk about in a moment, TR's father, was actually away for much of the Civil War. He didn't serve in the Civil War. We'll talk about that again in a moment. But he was away for most of the Civil War, which means that Theodore was raised in a household with his brother, two sisters, his mother, his grandmother, and his aunt, in addition to a retinue of mostly female housemaids and workers. He was surrounded by women in his life. And incidentally, I'll just take a moment to talk about those two brothers, James and Irvine. Absolutely dastardly were their deeds in the Civil War. I mean, so dastardly were their deeds that they were actually one of the few that were not granted clemency once the war ended. They were never allowed to return to the United States again and live the rest of their lives in England. So it's a fascinating kind of thought to think of Mitty, this Southerner in the most northern of northern cities, New York City, having her grandmother and her mother and her aunt along with her in this Roosevelt household. She also had four children in 6 years. She was widowed fairly early in her life, and she had this extraordinary message for her children. She said, "You need to live for the living, not for the dead." She said, "You would dishonor the memory of your father if you did not live a life of purpose." So it's kind of extraordinary when you think about it. What are the if you know nothing else about Theodore Roosevelt, perhaps you know he had this incredible personality, these witty sayings, and he had this ability to move through life with resilience, to overcome physical and emotional pain. Both of those qualities can be directed back to his mother. That's where he learned those things from. She also was the diametric opposite of her husband. There's this great quote from one of their in laws in which they said, "Between Mitty's liveliness and your solemnity, you make an even pair." It's the old cliche, opposites attract. And opposite they were. I'll talk about Thee in just a moment, but I want to just touch upon Theodore Roosevelt's childhood. So it's pretty commonly known that Theodore Roosevelt was born as an asthmatic, sickly child. He took to taxidermy and natural science. He really couldn't live the life outdoors that he wanted, so he lived his life through books and his imagination. He met when he was very, very young. Here you can see in the middle a little girl, 3 years old, Edie Carew. And Edie Carew lived just up the block from the Roosevelts at 28 East 20th Street. She lived not that far from somewhat from the Jones family, and the best, most wealthy New Yorkers kept moving north with the success of the city. As more immigrants came into the southern parts of Manhattan, the wealthy would continue to move north, and it was led by the Jones family. It's that old saying, keeping up with the Joneses. Now, interestingly, the Joneses' daughter, which was just a couple of blocks from Theodore as a child, was Edith, and she later married and became Edith Wharton. Had corresponded with TR for the rest of her life. So all of the works of Edith Wharton give you kind of an impression of what this society, what this age of innocence, as she put it, was like. So into this time is Edie Carreau. She comes from a family that actually had falling fortunes. The Carreaus were descending as the Roosevelts were ascending. She actually was homeschooled with the Roosevelt children, and she was known as the bonus sister, right? She was always there, always around, always a part of the Roosevelt family. So much so that later in life, they thought inevitably Theodore and Edith would marry. They were budding romance and sweethearts throughout their life. And then there's this consequential moment in TR's life when he's 12 or 13 years old, when his father takes him aside and says, Theodore, you have the mind, but you must make your body. If you do not make your body, your mind cannot go as far as it possibly can. And what's interesting about this is, of course, in the wonderful Pulitzer Prize winning trilogy that Steve mentioned at the outset by Edmund Morris, this is always sort of held up as the pivot point in TR's life. And it was, but it's also kind of interesting to think about Theodore just as an adolescent. He had been raised mostly by that retinue of women and primarily his mother. It was his mother who would massage his chest until the blood came out due to his asthma. Theodore had these horrible, racking nightmares, a recurring nightmare that he recounted in his autobiography, in which he thought that the devil was coming to take him away in the middle of the night. The beginning, the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt begins with the words, from the beginning, the survival of Theodore Roosevelt was very much in doubt. And that is true. His mother thought that he would not live past 4 years old. And so she protected him. She cocooned him. She wanted him to be safe. She took him to salons and cared for his health. Whereas his father's remedies for his asthma were to blow cigar smoke into his face or to take him on midnight rides in New York City, where the pollution of the age was terrible for his asthma. But there is this pivot point in adolescence. And like all adolescents, he has this moment where he rejects his mother and begins to embrace this father's outlook of manliness and body making and strength. So it's just interesting to consider, especially as we'll talk about in a moment, the early demise of Thee. So Thee, who is Thee Roosevelt? Again, between Mitty's liveliness and his solemnity, they make an even pair. He's Theodore Roosevelt's father and Eleanor Roosevelt's grandfather. He's a stern disciplinarian. He's a devout Christian, but not just a Christian. He believes in a very particular type of Christianity that's becoming popular at this time, the 1860s, 1870s. It's known as muscular Christianity. Actually, at this time, the depictions of Jesus become beefier, larger. You're seeing a sound body and a sound mind and a sound body being the principles of this muscular Christianity. He also believes the Christian precept that to whom much is given, much is required. He's involved in the family business, Roosevelt and Sons, technically a partner with his three brothers, but he doesn't really work there as much as he dedicates his life to philanthropy. He is the founder of the American Museum of Natural History. He is one of the founders of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He founds the first orthopedic hospital in the nation in the city of New York. And he's a consistent, devoted philanthropist to the newsboys and the orphanages throughout New York City. So he's got this really, I mean, he is rightfully the example from whom a lot of authors have taken inspiration in influencing TR. His 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 place in the TR mythology is only exacerbated by his sudden and unexpected death when TR is only 20 years old. But I do want to talk for a moment about how he worked during the Civil War. He hired a substitute during the Civil War and worked directly with President Abraham Lincoln on what was then a program to take part of the soldiers' pay and send it back to their families. Most of the soldiers in the Union were the breadwinners. When they went away, the families had a hard time making ends meet. So what he did instead of serving on the field of battle was to go around to all of the regiments and try to convince them to sign up to send part of their pay back home to their families. And he did this in part because Mitty forbade his participation on the battlefield. So fearful was she that he would meet her brothers on the field of battle. And his unexpected death at the age of 46 completely destroyed TR. He was only 20 years old at the time. And I just want to take another moment to point out one of the new discoveries in the loves of Theodore Roosevelt. So I was fortunate enough to discover 11 new letters that have never been published in any other book. They weren't available to Edmund Morris or to David McCullough when they wrote their extraordinary books. These letters, believe it or not, were locked in a safe in Sagamore Hill since 1954. And Harvard has called the discovery of these letters one of the most important sets of TR's correspondence to surface since his death in 1919. One of those letters is an extraordinary letter from December 31st, 1861, the year that the Civil War begins. And it's a letter from Thee to a 3-year-old Theodore. He can't yet read or write, so of course, someone else, probably his mother, is going to have to read this letter to him. And as you can see, the stationery is actually of a statue of Andrew Jackson. And the letter says, I have just come from a meeting with the president, would be President Lincoln, who governs our whole nation. And he has a statue outside of his home. And I want for you to have your mother to read what it says to you and learn it by heart. So when I get home, you can repeat it to me. And the statue says, the federal union, it must be preserved. An extraordinary letter when you think about one father writing his son about an encounter with President Lincoln. Of course, TR is the future president of the United States. That statue, by the way, still stands in Lafayette Square outside the White House. And he makes another wonderful reference in the letter about how it's similar to a statue that stands outside of Grandpa's house, which is in Union Square in New York City, a statue of George Washington that TR would actually use to navigate his way between his family home and his grandparents' home about 10 blocks away. So I just want to fast forward a little bit in the chronology of TR to TR's college years. So there's this thought that TR is sort of uber masculine, right? The Theodore Roosevelt we know from Mount Rushmore, and that is absolutely true. But there is another side to the story that has not been talked about much, and that is just how awkward he was as a child. He went to college in 1876 to Harvard, and he had this consequential year in 1878. On February 9th of 1878, Fee dies of stomach cancer. When Theodore was home from college at Christmas, there was no real sign that they didn't think he was going to live. He was sick, but nobody thought that he had a lethal disease. So he tried to make it home in time. He was alerted too late by his brother Elliot, something he never forgave his brother for, and was convinced that perhaps he told him intentionally too late to make it home. But he did not arrive in time to say goodbye to his beloved father. A few months later, on August 22nd, he had this explosive breakup with Edith. So we remember that little girl we met at one of the slides earlier, had known since she was 3 years old. Well, she turned 17 on August 6th of 1878. She was now of age to be engaged and wed. And everyone expected that Theodore and Edith would be a married couple. They would get engaged. So after her birthday in their diary, they talk about how they went picking water lilies and went out on the Long Island Sound together, how he exchanged presents with her. And then one night, August 22nd, they're walking up to a place known as Tranquility, which was anything but tranquil when the Roosevelt family was there. And we don't know what happened at Tranquility. We only know from Theodore and Edith two things. One, Theodore later said to his sister Bammy that we had, and I suppose have, tempers far from being the best. And Edith later said to one of her daughters that Theodore had simply not been nice. That's all we know. That's why we need a Netflix series about August 22nd, 1878. We can surmise what happened in that room, but nonetheless, they broke up and they looked like they were never going to be together again. 2 months later, Theodore meets Alice Hathaway Lee. So think about that sequence of events. He has this beloved father who dies unexpectedly. He breaks up with his girlfriend that everyone expects him to marry, and then he meets the girl of his dreams. And it's so fascinating reading his diaries from this time between when he lost his father, he broke up with Edith and met Alice. I don't talk about this often, but we're at a literary festival, so I can go ahead and go there. He uses these very unusual references. He references Edgar Allan Poe quite a lot. And specifically, he will go from talking about how devastated he is about the loss of his father. Oh, my father, my wondrous father, I can't imagine what I will do without his guidance and love. And I wonder who I might marry. A rare and radiant maiden, I suppose. I mean, it's a turn that you almost can't quite get your head around, that he's sort of equating the loss of the father with a need to find a wife, to find somebody who can be his partner and trusted advisor throughout life in the same way that he looked at as his father. But again and again, there are these references to the Raven, which of course will take on some significance when we think about what happens with Alice Hathaway Lee. So Alice Hathaway Lee, she is beautiful, beguiling, the most eligible bachelorette in all of Boston, which at this point you have to get the concept of the Theodore Roosevelt we know from Mount Rushmore out of your head. And remember, at 20 years old, Theodore is eccentric. All of his classmates say that he is half crazy, uncouth, that he is an emotional spin, a rudder that can't quite find its direction. He has specimens in various stages of decay in his pockets. In his wake, you smell formaldehyde. He is not the most likely candidate to win Alice Hathaway Lee, the most eligible bachelorette in Boston. She's a Boston Brahmin. She comes from this extraordinarily progressive family. There's this Boston toast, the doggerel Boston toast. And this is good old Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where the Lowells talk only to the Cabots and the Cabots talk only to God. She's a Cabot, right? That tells you the level of class that she was running in. She's been written off in history, especially by Edmund Morris, whom I talked to before his unfortunate, untimely death in 2019. And she was written off as a privileged Victorian, typical of the age, inconsequential. But what wasn't available to Edmund when he wrote his first of the three books, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, were 24 love letters that came to light after he wrote the books between Alice and TR, in which they exchange ideas. They talk about policy. They talk about politics. They talk about all these things that you couldn't possibly imagine that he and his wife would have talked about if you've read the previous books. I think she's kind of a gamine, playful, curious, intelligent. When I was reading her writing in those 24 letters, I thought of Audrey or Kate Hepburn. She's lively and vivacious. She reminds me, when I read her letters, of his mother, of Mitty, of this interesting kind of dynamic character who could really match him in terms of personality and athleticism. So I mentioned the Cabot family before. They were very progressive, reform-minded people. They believed in equal rights and suffrage, equal rights between races, equal rights between genders. And so again, put yourself in the mindset of TR. He's lost his father, he's lost his girlfriend, and all of a sudden he's in the presence of this extraordinary progressive family. They're talking politics, they're talking poetry, they're reading histories. There's a huge family of 15 members that share two plots of land about 12 miles, 6 miles from Cambridge, 12 miles round trip. And it was this family and Alice that steered TR toward politics. He wanted a career in natural science. He wanted to be a scientist. Two factors, to be fair, contributed to his departure. One, science was moving out of the out of nature and into the laboratory, and he didn't like that. And he met the Lees. She was so vivacious in her personality that her nickname was Sunshine. She was lively, engaging, athletic, a real dynamo, and he pursued her like mad. He spent the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars. He would travel that 12-mile round trip literally 50, 60 times a year. When he wanted to impress her, he got a horse, Lightfoot. And when he rode the horse so hard back and forth to Chestnut Hill and lamed the horse, he got a dog cart, which was the 1870s equivalent of a roadster. When he broke the roadster, he walked to her home, 12 miles round trip from Cambridge. And in the 1870s, the sign that you were with someone, the sign that you were officially a couple, was that you got a tintype, you got a photograph. And there are letter after letter of TR pleading with Alice, when shall we get our tintype? Can we please go get our tintype? Why haven't you responded to my request for a tintype? Well, finally, he gets one. And she brings her cousin. Oh, poor Theodore. There you could see the first picture on the right-hand side of the screen. Poor cousin Rose is right between TR, and you can see he looks really happy about it. He seems very pleased at this turn of events, and she's leaning gleefully into her cousin. The cousin doesn't look so happy. And somehow, of course, through the power of persuasion of TR's personality, he gets a second photo. And there he is. Now the cousin is standing and he's sitting. And if you look at that right hand, look how very, very close he is to touching the left elbow of Alice. Scandalous in the 1870s. That's TR getting his way with his wayward, willful darling, as he often called her. There was another factor in their romance, very significant to the success of Theodore Roosevelt's pursuit. Um, his sisters and his mother, Mitty. So desperate was TR to win over Alice that he actually invited his sisters and his mother to come visit and stay with the Lee family in Chestnut Hill, which they did. And then the Roosevelt sisters, and remember, Dad is out of the picture at this point, so it's just the mom and the two sisters, Bammy and Connie, invited them, the Lees, to come stay with them in New York. And it is my proposition that Alice fell in love as much with Theodore as she did with this extraordinary family. The idea of being a part of the Roosevelts, and in particular these two sisters, Bammy and Connie, which we'll hear more about in just a moment. But I have to, of course, stop first at this horrific event on February 14th, 1884. So he wins the hand of Alice. They announce their engagement on February 14th, 1880. They're married for 4 years. They have trouble conceiving and finally conceive their first child in 1883. That's when Theodore first comes out to the Badlands of North Dakota. It He's elected to his first statewide office. He writes his first book, The Naval War of 1812. It is in TR's own estimation that during those 4 years with Alice, he rose like a rocket. Um, and then this moment happens. So convinced is Theodore that Alice is going to have the baby on the anniversary of their engagement that he goes back to Albany and resumes his work as a state assemblyman, the youngest state assemblyman ever elected in the state of New York to this day. And he gets a telegram telling him the baby has been born on February 12th. Not much to think of it other than he needs now to get back to New York. He stays overnight and gets a second telegram. The contents of that telegram have been lost to history, but we do know from his fellow assemblymen his reaction. He went ashen white. He dropped the telegram and he ran from the New York State Assembly to the train station, and he took an agonizing 5.5 hour journey back to New York. Normally, that train ride would take 2 to 2.5 hours, but there was a thick, dense fog that had descended over the city. They he could not get a hansom cab from Grand Central Station. He had to walk the 15 blocks when you couldn't see more than an inch in front of your face to 6 West 57th Street, where his brother Elliot said, "There is a curse on this house. Mother is dying, and Alice is dying too." He ran up the stairs to the third floor to hold Alice until 2:30 in the morning when his family beckoned him to the second floor where Mitty died of typhoid fever. He went back up to the third floor and held Alice for an additional 11 hours when she too, at 1:30 in the afternoon of Valentine's Day, died of Bright's disease, a failure of the kidneys. He went to his diary and he wrote a large X. The light has gone out of my life. He didn't stand for re-election, and it was thought by Edmund Morris and others that he purged the memory of Alice from his soul. One thing that I counter in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt is that notion. I made what has been described as an extraordinary discovery. In the records at Sagamore Hill, there was a velvet box, looks almost like a Tiffany box, and it said Alice Hare. And we thought, well, that's the hair that was kept by Alice's mother, as many parents do then and certainly now, a little clipping. And indeed, that's what we first found. We found a clipping of Alice's hair at 8 months old, and we found a clipping of Alice's hair at 9 months old. But in a hidden compartment underneath, there was 16 inches of Alice's hair and a note in the unmistakable handwriting of Theodore Roosevelt, "The hair of my sweet wife Alice, cut after death." He also kept in this box pictures of Alice that he hid from his second wife, Edith, for the rest of their lives, a keepsake of his first marriage that has never before been discovered, hidden for decades at Sagamore Hill and revealed for the first time. So, how did he come out to the Dakotas? How did he come to North and South Dakota, given that he now had a baby? He depended on the ever reliant elder sister, Bammy. Bammy is just this extraordinary figure that has not gotten her due in history. She's TR's older sister and key political strategist. She is what Robert F. Kennedy was to John F. Kennedy. That she actually was said by Theodore Roosevelt's daughter that I always believed that if Bammy were a man, she, not my father, would be president of the United States. Later, that quote was read to Eleanor Roosevelt, and she concurred. She said, "I very much agree. That would have been so." She suffered a spinal defect in her youth, and she taught Theodore, her younger brother, resilience through physical pain. She lived at 1733 N Street while he was president of the United States, and so often he came to visit and consult with her that it was known in the press as the Little White House. Amazingly, years later, when Franklin D. Roosevelt served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the same role that TR had, he too, he and Eleanor, would live for a time at 1733 N Street. So Bammy influenced not just one, but two consequential presidents. She married in her late 40s and had her first and only child at age 42. She, very unheard of in 1897. She, it was hard for me to find a topic on which TR did not consult Bammy. Every single major decision he made in the White House, every single key move, she could see the political chessboard better than he could and knew who he needed to meet, what introductions needed to be made, and what advice he needed to consider and which he should set aside. And then there's his extraordinary younger sister, Connie. I think Eleanor Roosevelt put it best when she said, when you wanted advice, you went to Bammy. When you wanted sympathy, you went to Connie. She was the younger sister. She was a poet and an accomplished author. She was TR's source of emotional outlet and empathy or sympathy. They also brilliantly took advantage of the misogyny of the era. When Theodore Roosevelt was governor of New York, Connie would host these breakfasts for the bosses. So Boss Tweed and others would come, Boss Platt and others would come to the breakfast. And at some point, Boss Platt would say, "All right, now everybody clear out. I need my time with the governor." And Theodore, the governor of New York State at the time, would say, "Well, certainly my sister can stay. I mean, she's a woman. She'll be of no consequence to the discussion." And he would readily agree, and she would sit in the corner and knit and listen to everything that was being said. So consequential were these conversations that when he concluded his governorship, Theodore actually said to Connie, "Haven't we had fun being governor of New York?" So one sister, in the estimation of Eleanor Roosevelt, could have been president of the United States were she a man, and the other was so consequential that TR considered her the co-governor of New York. She was also his press secretary before the role existed. She would slip stories of the family antics to the press. She'd slip stories of his heroics in Cuba to the press. She knew better than TR did that if the people fell in love with he and his family, his policies would be more successful. And she's just also, in addition to Bammy, one of those extraordinary figures. But we have to also return to Edith. So that little girl that knew TR from 3 years old, that broke up with him at 17 years old, re-enters the picture. After the death of Alice, there's one thing that TR says to Bammy and Connie: when I'm back from the Dakotas in New York, I do not want to see Edie. He knows that if he sees Edie, they will fall back in love. And there will be, and he knew he wanted to abide by the Victorian code that if your spouse died, you lived the rest of your life honoring their memory. So upset was he with himself that when he returned to the Dakotas, he was known to pace the floor of the Ferris General Stores, repeating again and again, "I have no constancy. I have no constancy." Says he was guilt ridden. They kept their engagement a secret for almost a year. She was always, as I mentioned, outside of the inner circle, the bonus sister, right? Her family was on the decline as the Roosevelts were on the ascent. But suddenly, the bonus sister finds herself on the inside, the wife of Theodore, with much more influence, much more access. And she was the diametric opposite of Alice. This is a great quote. "Mrs. Roosevelt is more difficult of access. Praise does not reach or define her. She's taciturn. She's quiet. She is more of a thinker than and the exuberant personality of TR. TR could not have married two more diametrically opposite women than Alice and Edith, and he did so in the space of 6 years. She was known as her husband's political alter ego, an emotional rudder, one of the few people that could bring him back from one of his outbursts and calm and soothe his tempestuous nature. Unfortunately, Edith burned much of the correspondence between she and Theodore. So dedicated was she to the idea that he would perpetuate the myth of the self made man, that he alone had made all the decisions and she had nothing to do with it. Further, nothing could be further from the truth. We fortunately have the observations of many, many, many contemporaries around the Roosevelts who universally said she was a better judge of character, that she was the first person he talked to in the morning, the last person he talked to at night. They talked over every major consequential decision. She also outlived Theodore by 30 years and has these extraordinary adventures after his death. Everyone expects that she won't simply have a life of her own after he's gone. And she refers to her children at times as her beloved shackles, and has this great quote about her grandchildren after she's finally raised her beloved shackles and TR is gone. And she says of her grandchildren, "I like to see their little faces, but I prefer to see their backs." It's a tough woman. So I talked a little bit about this, and maybe in the Q&A we can get into this more if you'd like, the dynamic relationships between Bammy, Alice, and Connie and Edie, who all knew each other. And then, of course, when Alice is gone, the dynamic that shifts between Connie and Bammy and Edie. And this is the best example I can give. When Alice was alive and married to Theodore, and she's, by the way, the only one and that ever called him Teddy, which is why he largely did not like the nickname after he died, but knew enough not to fight it in the popular culture. But none of his family called him Teddy after the death of Alice, because that's almost exclusively what she called him. She would shout up the stairs, "Teddy is home, come and share him." Edie would say, "I think we've seen enough of Bammy and Connie for this season now." So it was a very, very different dynamic. I think anybody who has in-laws can probably relate to this discussion. Um, So I can't get through a lecture about the women in Theodore Roosevelt's life without talking about Alice Roosevelt Longworth. So that little girl that was born, unfortunately, when her mother died, basically in childbirth, the first born in 1884 of the six Roosevelt children, was the last to die in 1980. She was 96 years old. She knew every president from her father to Gerald Ford. And in the audiobook of The Loves of TR, we actually have recordings of the women that are in the book, including Alice's conversation with Richard Nixon, in which she teases him and says, "You're too old to be president. I just want to remind you that my father died at 60." So she was known as the second Washington Monument. It was said of Alice famously by her father, Theodore, "I can either run the country or I can control Alice, but I cannot possibly do both." And of course, Alice gave as good as she got. She's the one who described her father, Theodore, and said, well, he likes to be the baby at every christening, the bride at every wedding, and the corpse at every funeral. Uh, so, and by the way, remember, she's the only daughter of Alice and Theodore. So think about her personality and I mean, what Alice must have been like. The only living evidence we have of Alice is Alice, and she's extraordinary. She had this pillow in her home in Washington, D.C., and stitched into the pillow was, "If you haven't got anything good to say about anyone, come sit by me." And I mentioned before the 24 love letters that she donated to Harvard in 1986 that illuminated the life that TR and Alice had, really changed the perception of Alice's consequence in TR's life. And she has these remarkable observations about the dynamic between Alice, her mother, and Edie, her stepmother. She had a very, very tempestuous relationship with her stepmother. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you'd like. But she said she never, that of Edith, she never really forgave Theodore his first marriage. A really kind of interesting thing to think about, that Alice, in Theodore's memory, was forever 22. And of course, Edith, who had known TR his whole life, had to live. She in some ways was Theodore's first love and second wife. So quite a dynamic that played out between them. Now, I know I often like to personalize some of these talks, and we're here in South Dakota that has such a rich TR history and relationship. So I'll just point out that South Dakota was very good to Theodore Roosevelt. When he ran as vice president with McKinley in 1900, they won the state of North Dakota. When he ran on his own right, he far exceeded the results of McKinley. He won 71% of the vote here in 1904 in South Dakota. And then again, when he ran as an independent bull moose candidate, bolted the Republican Party in 1912, he won the state of South Dakota again. He lost North Dakota, incidentally, but he won South Dakota, and South Dakota was so determined to have him win that they kept Taft off the ballot in South Dakota. So there is no result for Taft. The party worked very strenuously to object to that, but did not succeed. And Roosevelt won the state of South Dakota, every time he was on the ballot here. Also, interestingly, I wanted to point out this pass from the Pine Ridge Reservation. So when Theodore was a civil service commissioner, he actually came out to South Dakota and visited the Pine Ridge Reservation to assess the conditions of Native Americans in the reservation, something that became more, he has a very troubled history with Native Americans during his time in North Dakota, but later he comes to South Dakota, sees the conditions, and becomes convinced that Native Americans might actually go extinct, and begins to work. He's the first president to actually say the word Native American in a presidential address to Congress. And a lot of those experiences in his home at Sagamore Hill, he has a lot of artifacts from the tribes of this region and these states. It's a interesting and complex relationship. Geronimo, he grants a private audience with Geronimo during his 1905 inaugural, and Native Americans march in his inaugural parade, which I'll talk about more in a moment. And a lot of that came from his experiences here in North and South Dakota. And of course, he had this tremendous relationship with Seth Bullock, Deadwood's first sheriff and one of the Dakota Territory cowboys. In 1898, it's actually Bullock who puts a rival to the Rough Riders together with TR's encouragement, known as Troop A in Grigsby's Cowboy Regiment. Doesn't quite have the same, doesn't roll off the tongue like the Rough Riders, but nonetheless, they did it. They took a 2-month Western trip together when TR was president in 1903. And in 1905, as I mentioned, Seth Bullock organized a group of cowboys to ride in the inaugural parade, and TR in turn appointed him the first U.S. Marshal of South Dakota. In 1917, TR and Bullock wanted to ride again. He was one of the 18 that TR called upon to put a volunteer infantry together. It never came to pass. Wilson did not allow the infantry to go and fight in World War I. And just one last point of South Dakota connection. On July 4th, 1919, which is only 6 months after TR's death, the very first major monument to TR was dedicated. It was led by Seth Bullock here in South Dakota. That is Roosevelt Tower. It was the first posthumous honor and memorial to TR after his death. So determined was Seth to make sure that he was honored in the state of South Dakota. So that is a brief overview of this incredible and extraordinary family, the loves of Theodore Roosevelt, and I would be honored and glad to take your questions. Yes, and I think we've got mics, but if you don't need them, you can shout and I'll repeat it. Yes. Okay. So the question is, how are Eleanor and FDR related? So first, Eleanor is TR's niece. So there's two branches of the Roosevelt family. When they date all the way back to the 1600s with the Dutch immigrants that are coming over to settle what will become New York City. And one branch is known as the Hyde Park Roosevelts, and the other branch is known as the Oyster Bay Roosevelts. So TR and excuse me, Eleanor and FDR are fifth cousins. You have to go back 5 generations on that family tree to see any intersection between them. But interestingly, they remained very close. I mean, the families knew each other, even though the relationship was very distant. It was actually at a Christmas party at Connie's house that Eleanor and FDR meet for the first time. And that's the moment they actually both describe as the moment that they fell in love, that they saw someone that they were very interested in. And Eleanor spent a lot of time, particularly after the death at age 34 of her father. She was orphaned. Her mother had died, and her father subsequently died. And so she spent a lot of time at Oyster Bay. And in fact, Bammy and TR briefly discussed suing for custody of Eleanor after the death of Elliot, her father. They didn't pursue it because ultimately Eleanor's grandmother on the Hall side of the family, her mother's side of the family, took custody, and that's where she was raised. Yes. Yes, thank you for asking that question. Yes, that is a very important question. So, did Theodore Roosevelt ever advocate for suffrage? In 1880, writing in his senior thesis, very influenced by Alice and the Lee family, Theodore Roosevelt writes and endorses not only suffrage, but he endorses a woman's right to be a doctor, a lawyer, or a judge. He writes that women should have equal pay to men, that women should own property, and suggests that women should not necessarily take their husband's name upon marriage. All pretty revolutionary thoughts for someone in 1880. So that's 40 years before suffrage. When he becomes president, he takes an audience with Susan B. Anthony. There are four states that had suffrage when he was president. By the time he runs again in 1912, there were 11. His party platform in 1912 for the Progressive Bull Moose is the first major party platform to endorse suffrage officially as a part of their platform. That campaign was the first to allow women to serve as chairs, not only at the state level, but the national level. And he is the first person to be major party nominee to have his nomination seconded by a woman. That was Jane Addams, the reformer in Chicago at Hull House and a dedicated suffragist. So yes, it's an interesting that all relate. Interestingly, Bammy um, and Connie did not support suffrage. It was it was pretty common in the era that influential, wealthy families would not necessarily support suffrage because what was the point of a vote when you had influence through money or you had the patriarch of the family really representing the family's interest in the vote? So not all the voices in his ears supported it. Edith did support suffrage, and she was so his two wives, Alice and Edith, supported it, but his two sisters did not. Yes. Yes. So the question is, did TR's move to the Dakotas help his health? Absolutely. Yes. Theodore later said, I never would have been president except for my experiences in North Dakota. And he meant it. Later on in life, in 1918, he exchanges a letter with a senator from New Mexico, Albert Fell, in which he says, if you take all of the memories of my life, and remember, this is in 1918, so he's been president of the United States. He's gone down the Amazon and the River of Doubt. He served in the Spanish-American War in the Rough Rider Regiment. He's gone on his safari in Africa and delivered the Man in the Arena speech in Europe. He says, if you left me but one memory in my life, I would keep my days as a rancher and cowboy in the Dakotas. He came out here dejected and depressed. He first traveled to this region in 1880 on a hunting trip with his brother, and then he returned. And this was, the train wouldn't go any further than Medora. He went as far west as he possibly could, and he spent about 10 days in Dakota hunting and he invested $14,000, half of his inheritance, in cattle while he was there. So before Alice died, he envisioned a life both in the East and in the West. He wanted to have this balance of nature. And that's what kind of makes him the quintessential president for the American century, right? That he's got a Northern father, a Southern mother. He's born in the East and a political identity in the West. And it's really in nature that nature was his healer and classroom throughout his life. Steve mentioned in the introduction, I'm the CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library Foundation. We're currently under construction with a presidential library and museum dedicated to Theodore Roosevelt in the Badlands of North Dakota in Medora. We've raised 321 million in the last 4 years. Snøhetta is our architect, a Norwegian and U.S. firm that designed the 9/11 Museum in New York. We're about 50% of the way there, and we'll open on July 4th, 2026, the 250th anniversary of America. And the whole idea of this presidential library and museum is to be very different than the others. It's to get families out into nature, to ride on horseback, to go on a bike ride, to learn about nature, to really live as TR did in the beauty of the North and South Dakota Badlands. And as we were saying to Steve, I think the effect will be positive on South Dakota as well, right? We're envisioning the TR triangle where people will come to South Dakota, visit Mount Rushmore and some of the wonderful state parks and regions, maybe travel up to Medora, go to the museum, and then further out west to Glacier and Yellowstone and some of these beautiful spots. So yes, the nature healed TR, and it was here in the Badlands that he recovered. Yes.
powerful women encourage his conservation efforts throughout his life going forward, his time with John Muir, things like that?
Yes. So the question is, did any of the women in his life encourage his conservation efforts? Yes. The entire Roosevelt family were big outdoor enthusiasts. I mean, there's these great moments from his childhood where, they say, uh, you know, uh, TR, Theodore and Fee went 22 miles, and Bammy went 18 miles, and Connie went 12 miles. And they were a very competitive family out in nature. The concept of conservation in the early 1900s was an academic concept, as you're referring, right? The John Muir's and the Hudson Society, and Theodore listened to them. I mean, he was an academic. He read books. He said, "I am a part of everything I have read." He really wanted to understand this movement. When Theodore Roosevelt proposed his first conservation bill to Congress, the Speaker of the House said, "There will not be one dime for scenery." I mean, scenery. So there was no counter argument. There was no other side. It was sort of like, what are you talking about? The land is there to be used. We use it. And the women in his life, through their love of the outdoors, through their love of nature, and again, Bammy and he talked about every major issue. She was the one who really encouraged him to embrace the idea that if you take action as an executive, which he did often, some controversy, that Congress will be left to debate you and not the action you took, which was a very clever way of thinking about it. And that's how he did most of his conservation work. Is Congress wasn't going to help him, but they passed the Antiquities Act, so he used the Antiquities Act to conserve, 234 million acres of land, 150 national forests, to double the size of the national parks, to establish the first game preserves and fish and wildlife preserves, to establish the U.S. national forests. I mean, an extraordinary record that really has not been equaled to this day. Is there one in the back? Yes. So the question for anybody who couldn't hear is, what piqued my interest in Theodore Roosevelt? Well, as you might know, growing up in North Dakota, you kind of suffer a surfeit of heroes, right? We've got Peggy Lee, we've got Lawrence Welk. There's some choices. Maybe contemporary. We've got Chuck Klosterman for the literary crowd. So Theodore Roosevelt, I think, is built into the ethos of the Dakotas. It's the storytelling that we hear. I would travel out west. I grew up in Grand Forks, North Dakota, just up the road on I-29, and I would travel out west, go to Medora, North Dakota, see the musical, be in the Badlands, which largely look exactly like he described. I mentioned that he wrote about Edgar Allan Poe when his father died. He writes about Poe again when he's out in the Badlands. He says the Badlands look as though Edgar Allan Poe writes, and that tells you something about his state of mind when he was there. But I was always fascinated by TR, and I spent 20 years in media, as Steve said during the introduction. I never had any time to really research him, and I thought I would write about Theodore Roosevelt's time in the Badlands, about this magical time, as the other person asked about, that healed him and renewed him and gave him the resilience and spirit to move forward in life. And I think when I was researching the loves of Theodore Roosevelt, what I discovered is, wow, I've never heard about these women. I mean, I've heard of them, they've been a part of stories, but they've never been the story. And what it said to me is, you know, we all have, if we're fortunate, a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, a sibling, a friend, a colleague, somebody who picks us up and pushes us when we're down, that tells us it's going to be okay and gives us the strength to carry forward. And Theodore Roosevelt was no different. He had that too. And as much as I like the self-made man myth, the myth that I grew up with, those stories of sort of inevitability. You look at Mount Rushmore and think, It's this all-powerful person who needed no help. I think this creates a much more universal TR that everyone can relate to because we've all had that moment where we needed somebody and TR was no different. So, one more. Okay. One more. Yes. Sure. Okay. So I'm identifying the folks in this photograph. This is Theodore Roosevelt and his 6 children. So the tallest member of the family, the eldest, is Alice, who will later go on to be Alice Roosevelt Longworth. Longworth, incidentally, was Speaker of the House. So she married the Speaker of the House at the time, and the wedding was at the White House. Next to Alice is her brother Ted Jr. So that's the eldest son of Theodore Roosevelt. The second eldest boy there that you can see is Kermit. Kermit was, so he's the tallest next to Alice. Then seated on Theodore's lap is Archibald. So that's his other son, Archibald, and seated on Edith's lap. So that's Edith, his wife, his second wife. That is their youngest son, Quentin. And the death of Quentin during World War I will devastate TR. I mean, it's story like the story of John in the John F. Kennedy administration. Everybody knew Quentin. He grew up in the the limelight of the White House, and he is the son who dies in World War I. And there's this tragic scene I write about in the book where, TR, he doesn't talk to many people about it, and then he confesses his true feelings to a stranger and actually goes out into the horse barn and weeps next to the horse of Quentin after his death. It really broke him and was kind of the end of his strenuous life. And then on Theodore's right hand is Ethel. And Ethel, I didn't talk about her much today. Probably no one in the family more responsible for saving the legacy of Theodore Roosevelt than Ethel. She's involved in they save his boyhood home in New York. They make the American Museum of Natural History in New York the New York State Memorial to TR. She's around for the discussions about whether TR should be on Mount Rushmore, and is one of the active forces to persuade them to include TR on Mount Rushmore. Ethel saves all the letters, and Ethel is actually the one who comes to Sagamore Hill on the day of Edith's death, where she is literally throwing letters into the fire and takes the letters and holds on to them and preserves them, doesn't release them for many, many years until Edmund and Sylvia Morris start poking around. And finally, Edmund and Sylvia convince Ethel to let them come and let them come and read the letters that she's been preserving for about 50 years since her mother's death. So pretty extraordinary family. There you go. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you this afternoon at the book signing.